Today is Friday, December 19th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. A tragic plane crash in North Carolina claims the lives of a NASCAR star and his family. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can always email us, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. That's our email address, quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Joining me now to get through the news of the day, as we do each and every weekday here, bright and early, Tré Goins-Phillips. And on the focus story, Tré, we're taking a look at some disturbing news from Central America.
Yeah, so in Nicaragua, if you're a tourist and you have a Bible with you, you should probably leave it behind. At least that's what the government there is trying to do. So we'll talk about the details here in a minute.
Crazy. All that's coming up momentarily. Also on the main thing, our interview with Lee Strobel has more to say about that Christmas book he has out right now. So we want to get to that conversation coming up on the main thing. All right, I want to tell you right now about the sponsor to the Quick Start podcast, Christian Solidarity International, CSI, a great ministry, as we've been telling you about. If you haven't already, consider joining with them to help them do the work on the ground, helping persecuted Christians. I would strongly urge you to do so. Their website, csi-usa.org. They're out there in some of the hardest places in the world to be a Christian, like Nigeria and other places that are being intensely persecuted. They help people on the ground there, getting them food, getting them safe shelter, medical care to families who have lost everything. They're coming around those pastors and church communities who are trying to shepherd their flocks in the midst of all of that. And so CSI comes alongside them and they help in any way they can. Of course, bringing the gospel along with them to support and encourage other believers there that it may be struggling. So if you feel led to help, any amount helps the work that's going on the ground there. You can go to the website, csi-usa.org, csi-usa.org. And we're going to go to the news now in 90 seconds. In a devastating plane crash in North Carolina, a private jet went off the runway and exploded, as shocking images have shown. It went down in rural North Carolina while officials continue working the scene. NASCAR star Greg Biffle and his wife, Cristina, and their two children, Emma and Ryder, are confirmed to be on that plane, according to a close family associate. The crash has drawn an outpouring of grief, not just because of his racing legacy, but because of the humanitarian work that he does. And Garrett Mitchell had been working closely with him in recent months, especially during Hurricane Helene relief efforts, helping transport supplies and equipment and aid to hard-hit communities across the Southeast. Mitchell and others used private aviation to move faster than traditional relief channels, reaching isolated areas when roads were washed out and infrastructure was crippled. Investigators are now working to determine the cause of the crash. And the Trump administration is moving toward effectively shutting down so-called gender-affirming care for minors nationwide, not by changing laws, but by cutting off federal money. Bottom line, they're using federal funding to leverage and to draw a hard line, saying children should be protected from life-altering medical interventions, while critics warn the move could reshape pediatric care nationwide. Those are some of the big stories today. Check out cbnnews.com for more. And this move by President Trump, I mean, it's crazy, Tré, that this is even happening in the first place at hospitals, the ones who are supposed to be providing actual health care. And the fact that these trans surgeries, essentially body mutilation, especially for minors, the fact that this is something they're even entertaining is just demonic.
Yeah, I don't see how we look back on this in retrospect years down the road and don't see this as anything other than parental abuse of children and ultimately societal abuse of children. So, I mean, the fact that taxpayer dollars, that humanitarian charitable money that's been given to like all of this money, a chunk of it is going to doing these kinds of surgeries, and that should be appalling to everyone. I don't care what your worldview or your perspective is. If a minor is receiving surgery that is obviously irreversible, if you're cutting off a body part, They can't do anything to put that back. And also the fact that we're sterilizing boys and girls who are 10, 12, 13, 14 years old, they can't make those decisions. I mean, nobody should be making that decision, but putting that power in a child's hand,
Yeah.
that is nothing short of demonic.
Well, and we should have known this was coming because I remember a few years ago and somebody reshared this and it went viral again. If you remember on ABC, I think it was Good Morning America. They had a kid who was probably 10 or something, dressed up like a drag queen and doing a catwalk into this cheering crowd, and almost like watching a bunch of pedophiles on display cheering this. It was so bad. But this is what they were thinking is good. And so like society's got it all upside down right now. So it's incredibly frustrating to watch this play out. But then it like leaked into hospitals, even the medical professionals who should know better buying into this stuff. And so this is the Trump administration taking action on that, where they're not being responsible with the authority that's been given to them. So Trump's trying to force the hand here. We'll see what happens. We're going to go to the focus story now. And we talked about how Nicaragua is banning something for tourists, and it's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, so Nicaragua has introduced a new restriction that tourists entering the country are no longer allowed to bring their Bibles with them or any Bibles with them. Notices posted at the Tica bus terminals in Costa Rica, which serves routes into Nicaragua's capital of Managua. They list Bibles among the items that are now prohibited from crossing into the Nicaraguan border. Along with Bibles, nobody can bring magazines, newspapers, cameras, knives, perishable foods, or drones. So some of those other ones, you could see a security risk. You could see a reason, okay, you can't bring a knife, you can't bring a drone. Okay, I can maybe understand those things, but somebody's saying you can't bring newspapers and you can't bring scripture. And the reason, I would assume, is because Nicolas Maduro's regime, they don't want outside information coming in, outside information that would be in any way critical of this heavy-handed government. They don't want that information coming in and threatening their regime. So this is the new policy going into Nicaragua. If you've got a Bible, you're just coming to be a tourist planning on leaving in a week or two, you still can't bring it with you.
Yeah. What are the religious freedom advocates saying about this?
Yeah, so advocates for religious freedom, of course, see the ban as part of an ongoing crackdown on civil liberties and freedom of expression, of religious expression in Nicaragua. Anna Lee Strobel of the Christian Solidarity Worldwide, she's publicly urged Nicaraguan leaders to lift the ban immediately and, of course, to, about face and protect freedom of religion and expression, and has also called on international leaders around the world to put that pressure on Nicaragua and on the Maduro regime to reverse this restriction. And the restriction comes amid broader concerns about the repression of religious freedom and specifically religious groups inside Nicaragua. So this is not a new issue.
And so you mentioned that broader trend. What is the broader trend going on in that country right now?
Yeah, so the Bible ban, according to representatives from the Tica bus terminals and elsewhere, they've said that this ban has been in place for at least half a year, even though it's just now kind of making the rounds internationally. But it's part of a larger pattern of tightening control under the regime there, and including a reported withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council in response to criticism of human rights abuses. So independent civil society organizations, including many religious Christian groups, they've had their legal status revoked since 2018, which is reflecting escalating limits on dissent and religious freedom there in Nicaragua. So certainly something to be concerned about and paying attention to.
Yeah, it really is. And anytime we see things like this popping up around the country, we know other countries don't have the protections that we have. But we also know that our country has been trying to do certain persecutions and against Christians that we've seen, not to that extent quite yet, but we know they view the Bible as hate speech and a danger. We see what China's doing and editing it and trying to change it and the threat they see it as. So, I mean, this is something that's interesting to me because you don't see these efforts, generally speaking, against Muslims, against, different other varying religions when it comes to the teachings of that religion. But we do see it with Christianity, which I find interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And one quick note I want to make, because I just realized, thinking back to what I said a minute ago, I misnamed the president. I said Maduro. He's the president of Venezuela.
Yeah, I didn't catch that
Ortega
when
is
you
the
did it,
president. Ortega is the president of Nicaragua. So sorry about that name mix up there. But either way, I still think this is an issue. The Ortega regime, we need to be paying attention to and praying for our brothers and sisters in Christ who are in Nicaragua facing this pressure from the Ortega government.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, important one to put on our prayer lists, and we all need to be praying for that and persecuted Christians all around the globe, and these different ways that just Christianity in general is suppressed, or at least they try to suppress it. But we know the gates of hell will not prevail against God, so we can rest in that, but we still need to be praying because we're called to. All right, we're going to go to the main thing now. And Tré caught up with author Lee Strobel about his new book, The Case for Christmas. We talked about that with Hobby Lobby earlier in the week, how they're giving away this book, 500,000 copies of it over the holiday. Well, he breaks down the compelling historical evidence for the Nativity and explains why biblical accounts of Jesus' birth differ. That conversation is today's main thing.
He wrote this book initially in the early 2000s, and you said there's so much more in the book, and really, I mean, it's chock full of brand new information that just wasn't available the first time the book was written. So give us a little bit of a kind of a big picture overview of what it is in this book that convinced you, you know what, there's so much new and compelling information that I need to compile a new version of The Case for Christmas.
Well, one of the things is the question of whether or not there was really an inn and an innkeeper in that first century Bethlehem account. There's some fascinating new research on that. The Luke account says that Jesus was placed in a manger because there was no room for Mary and Joseph and the Greek word is katalima. And the King James Version translated that as an inn. And so the story developed that Mary and Joseph are coming to Bethlehem for the census, and they go to an inn, and the innkeeper, mean old guy, says, sorry, no room. And he closes the door, and they don't know what to do. So they go to a stable, and she gives birth among the animals and puts the baby in a manger. It's probably not accurate, probably not the best translation. In fact, in the year 1595, I think it was, John Wycliffe in his translation, even the NIV today, which is the most popular translation of the Bible, I think, in America, it doesn't mention the inn. It's a guest room. So you have to understand what a house looked like in first century Bethlehem. It was one large room divided into two parts. The larger part was the family area. That's where the family would eat and sleep and so forth. And then there were a couple of steps down to kind of a side area, and that's where they would bring the farm animals at night. You know, they had a couple of sheep, a couple of goats, and often the sheep and the goats would come up the steps into the living area, and they were like pets. I mean, what's cuter than a little lamb, right? And so there was a manger in the living area as well as in the animal area. Well, some of the larger, more wealthy homes had a katalima, which is a guest room, had a separate entrance, and it was a bigger home. That's apparently where Mary and Joseph had the baby Jesus. What apparently happened is they came into Bethlehem, they knocked on the door of a relative and said, hey, we're here for the census. And they said, oh, great, but so many other people are too. There's no room in the guest room, the katalima, where we'd normally put you. But hey, how about the living area? And so I believe that Mary gave birth in that living area and put the baby in the manger. And probably a few of the animals heard the commotion, probably came up the steps and checked things out. They may have been present at the time of the birth of Jesus. But that seems to be a better translation. Luke only uses the word katalima one other time, and in that instance, it's a private residence. There's another word that he uses, pandoheion in the Greek, which he uses in the story of the Good Samaritan to indicate a lodge or an inn. So if he wanted to say an inn, he would have used that word probably, but he didn't. He used the word for guest room. So I think that's probably the best translation. And there may not even have been an inn in Bethlehem back then. I mean, it was a small town, 500 people, wasn't on major thoroughfares. And it would have been socially impossible for an innkeeper to turn away a pregnant Jewish woman in first. The value of hospitality was so high, he would be ridden out of town on a rail. He would have been ostracized. He would have been put out of business if he were to do that to a pregnant Jewish woman. So I think probably the best translation, as John Wycliffe had in 1395, is it's a guest room. And that is probably what took place.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And look, so often at Christmas time, the go-to book that we read is Luke. We read Luke's account of the Nativity, and Luke was a researcher, and you also by trade are an investigative journalist. So I think there's probably a lot of similarities in how you would go about gathering information, gathering data. But also there's an account of the Nativity in the book of Matthew. And your book walks through some of the comparisons between those two Nativity stories. So talk about the differences and the similarities there.
Yeah, what's important is that these are compatible. What's important, they're independent accounts. And so we have two accounts coming very early about the birth of Jesus. And the Luke account, Luke said, I carefully investigated everything so I could write an orderly account about the certainty of what took place. He was, as you say, sort of a first century investigative reporter. He wrote his account from Mary's perspective. I think he interviewed Mary. If not, I think he interviewed Joanna and Susanna, who he mentions in his gospel, who were friends with Mary. So he kind of got the inside story from Mary's perspective. Matthew was a tax collector who became a disciple of Jesus and wrote his gospel. He's right there in the first century, but he later became a leader of the church in Jerusalem. And one of the other key leaders, of course, was James, a half-brother of Jesus. And James probably told Matthew about the birth of his brother Jesus, but from the male perspective. In fact, I was talking to a woman the other day who was a mother of a little child, and I was talking about this, and she said, I totally get it. She said, if you ask me about the birth of our child, I give you one version. If you ask my husband, he's going to give you another version. It's the same birth, but we see it from different perspectives. And I thought, yeah, that's so true, isn't it? And so we have two very early accounts. And then in Mark, who, of course, is writing based on the recollections of Peter, who was a disciple, he starts his gospel later than that, so he doesn't include a birth narrative. But in Mark 6, verse 3, he refers to Jesus as Mary's son. You don't do that in first century Jewish culture. You would have referred to him as Joseph's son, even if Joseph were deceased. And so I think that was kind of a wink by Mark to say, hey, yeah, I know that Joseph wasn't the biological father. So I'm going to refer to him as Mary's son. And then John, of course, writes last. He doesn't repeat a lot in the earlier Gospels, but he has this theological approach. You know, he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word came into our world and dwelt among us. So he takes this big theological description of the incarnation. But interestingly, he had a disciple himself, someone he mentored, and that guy wrote a letter, very early letter. And in that letter, he said that Jesus was, quote, really and truly born of a virgin. Where did he get that idea? I think from his mentor, John.
All right, appreciate that conversation there. That's going to leave us with time in the podcast today for one last thing.
We're looking at Joshua 1:9 today. It says, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Got a little tongue-tied there, but I think it's a great verse to remember, especially amidst that story coming out of Nicaragua.
Yeah, absolutely. And keep your eyes fixed on him and keep an eye on his promises, and always rest and marinate in those, because when we're all going to face turbulent times, and different persecutions of one level or another. So got to be ready for them. And that's a great verse to help us do just that. All right, make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com, faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective and help persecuted Christians in need. Go to csi-usa.org. God bless. See you back here on Monday.